Hi, everyone, and welcome to another exciting edition of Words, Images, and Worlds. Delighted to be traveling in from the Force, I think, on this episode. Just prior to hitting record, I seem to have become a Jedi of some kind. So let me try this. You do not want to sell me death sticks.
I don't want to sell you death sticks.
Wow, wow, that totally worked. Wow. Okay. The Zoom tricks continue to amaze.
You're
But
not the droids I'm looking for.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, yeah. So delighted on this episode to be talking with someone who clearly knows their Star Wars lore, and has done some wonderful creating, lots of wonderful creating, and that is author and artist Nate Powell. Nate, thank you for talking with me for a few minutes.
Happy to be here. Thanks.
Happy to have you. So happy to have you. You were talking about Andrew Aiden a little while ago, and he was on a couple of episodes ago. So
Oh,
we
sweet.
explored a little bit of March from that side. So we'll definitely mention March, but there are so many titles. I was just sort of taking stock of everything that you've done, save it for later, being one of the most emotionally impactful sort of stories of living through the pandemic period, and all of the crazy things. There were panels in that book that really resonated with me. The panel where you're going to the grocery store of all things. Yeah, that was one thing that I was like, yes, absolutely.
I appreciate it. And a lot of it is like the impetus for making that book in the first place, like even late 2017, was realizing that uh, just within a year under this like sort of authoritarian power grab, things were
Hmm.
happening so fast and there were so many fires that people were scrambling to kind of take care of that almost immediately I noticed that not just people around me, but that I uh, had even sort of downgraded the the sense of self license to sort of talk about the private and personal ways that living under that under that year had already impacted my family, impacted me, impacted the way I was approaching the world. And I realized I sort of needed to carve space to talk about the personal side
Hmm.
of the impact of like all this upheaval, or it would be lost. And I've actually thought I finished the book in January 2020. And I was like, well, here we go.
Hmm. Hmm.
And
Hmm.
then, as we know, everything changed again so rapidly. And, that sort of magnified that need, recognizing that we'd immediately be memory holding a lot of stuff and like
Hmm.
recognizing that there's value in that the personal is the political, but also just in the fact that like there is validity to our experiences and we're not alone in them. And so if
Hmm.
we don't carve out that space, sort of like the magic of comics and the magic of print media is like, I was telling something that was personal to me, but the reason why I was doing it was because these were experiences that were very broadly shared.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's a book that I return to and continue to think about. And the choices you made in rendering your children as sort of these sort of magical creatures in a way. Just so much there to unpack and to dig into. Um, Come Again being another book of yours, which is sort of psychological thriller or
Yeah,
horror. It's really interesting.
thank you.
Swallow Me Whole, Any Empire. I mean, you have all of these books that sort of dive into the inner life and questions of life and the psychology of characters. So lots to celebrate from your work. Absolutely.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so when in your life did you know I'm going to tell my stories in comics?
For me, like I started reading comics when I was 3. I started drawing when I was 3, and I
Mhm.
remained really devoted to both of those activities. But for some reason, I never put two and two together that I could draw comics.
Mhm.
And then I guess it was right at the end of 6th grade. So I was like 11 and a half. And my sort of new best friend had been drawing comics for a couple of years. And it really took him saying the words. It was like an incantation where he's like, we should make comics together. And
Mhm.
just like a light went off in my head. And I was like, oh.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I seriously never looked back from that moment in 1990. So we got incredibly serious as junior high schoolers. and the two of us started self-publishing about 2 years later. And so for me, like, that's a pretty cut and dry question. Like, a lot of me still feels like I'm 12 making, back then I was making like dystopian, like guns and boobs superhero comics, but I
Hmm.
was
Hmm.
still also talking about like a team of ragtag misfits trying to take down an authoritarian, you know, oppressive system, just using the language of junior high metalheads.
Yeah.
So I feel like a lot of the comics I make, both fiction and nonfiction, are still not that different from the superhero comics I made as a seventh grader.
I love that. I love that. And that leads me to where I was going to talk about next with the storytelling that you do, because I think sometimes people assume comics are all about superheroes. That's sort of what they do. And looking back over many of the titles that I've mentioned, I mean, Congressman John Lewis is a superhero in his own right, I believe, was and continues to be. But I don't know that there's a necessarily a book that I have on my list that folks might look at and go, "Oh, it's Captain America. Oh, it's a superhero book." Um, and stepping into a high school classroom after spending some time in the college classroom, when I started talking about my love of comics, I immediately had a student go, "Are you going to make us read those superhero books?" Like, maybe, maybe not. There's a lot there. Hi, Anna, by the way, if you're watching this, that would be that student. So just curious about what you see as the possibilities for the medium because you tell a wide range of stories.
You bet. And the thing about comics is comics is a medium of communication.
Hmm.
Uh, Comics is also, or I should say, comics are a format for visual storytelling, and comics is also a language. And
Hmm.
all three of these things exist simultaneously, and so you can sort of break apart um, the ways in which you know comics function as a formal object or a way of reading, uh, but also a way of thinking and perceiving from the reader's side of things.
Hmm.
And in that way, like you know, this isn't the most original idea, but it's true. Comics are virtually limitless in their potential. Like, there are a lot of unique strengths that comics have as a language and as a medium. And some of that, people have spent decades talking a lot about those strengths, including me. A lot of that is the capacity for empathy, but also for a reader simply placing themselves in
Hmm.
the experiences of the characters and the subjects about which they're reading. And for me, the way I like to express that is there's an immediacy in comics that sort of supersedes our conscious ability to process or judge what we're reading.
Hmm.
And I
Hmm.
think that's where empathy really gets a leg up there. Um, is our ability to see ourselves in other people's experiences, whether fictional or nonfiction, and sort of the emotional resonance there. It's also like, there's a time travel component both from the creator's side and the reader's side with comics, and a lot of that is simply that comics are both a very linear storytelling experience and an extremely non-linear experience. The fact
Hmm.
that we are following these conventional rules from beginning to end, but part of the way comics work and work well in fiction and nonfiction is the ability of the reader to decide what the pacing means to them, how the flow works for them, the ability to stop their reading experience and cross-reference things, check things. And this is where a lot of the rhythms of comics, especially the visual rhythms and like leaning into repetition, there's
Hmm.
so there's so much intentional action happening from the creator's side of things. And when you're reading a comic, like, there's so much value in a reader allowing themselves to go back and check things and see where things have been repeating, to see where seeds have been planted throughout the experience. And that, I think, is the most unique feature of comics that does
Hmm.
not exist in any other linear narrative storytelling medium. Um, yeah.
Love it, love it. You're making me think about how often I ask my students to look for motifs. And, we talk about these things as though they're only from literature in the 1800s or the modern language movement or something like that. And that absolutely speaks to the literary nature of comics.
You bet. And I guess like bouncing off of that, I think an important distinction here is the fact that a lot of the a lot of the creative decisions and the storytelling decisions are very similar to what's happening with prose writers of all kinds. But
Hmm.
it's important when reading comics to recognize that, yes, we all understand, at least consciously, that comics are a combination of words and images which work to do something together. But I have found, especially since the release of March 10 years ago,
Hmm.
I have felt the need to kind of underline that there is so much information that is not textual and is not verbal.
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
and simply because something doesn't exist as text does not mean that it is not information, and doesn't mean that it doesn't have an equal or even greater weight than the text.
Hmm.
A lot of this is like this is where you edge into hippie territory, but it's really true that you just kind of need to be mindful of the fact that you're absorbing stuff all over the page,
Hmm.
uh, and don't try to weigh it or quantify it against the textual information. Just
Yeah.
allow yourself to absorb all of it and recognize that it has value. This is where our brains are actually working overtime
Hmm.
when reading comics compared to prose.
Yeah, absolutely. Just thinking about the use of light or shadow, the white spaces versus the sort of darkened spaces on the page, and then the expressions of characters. March, I very often read right before bed, and March is not one of those books that I can read before bed because it's so emotionally
For
investing
sure.
and charging. Um, yeah, so curious about what you think about comics as sort of these social commentaries, these spaces for personal reflection, again thinking about that grocery store scene, and other scenes of belligerent people sort of being in community or against community, as well as kind of speaking to some of the larger issues that we deal with.
You bet. I'd say when we're talking about, what you're referencing here is a scene from my book Save It for Later, which is
Hmm.
happening in the first month of the pandemic. It's an early trip to the grocery store, um, where things are just kind of settling in and no one knows exactly what they're dealing with, or how this is going to rapidly transform each of our communities. Um,
Hmm.
but from Save It for Later, and also from a historical perspective, like John Lewis's account of dealing with combative, militant racists
Hmm.
throughout, being a young person in the civil rights movement. One of the strengths of using comics to convey these subjective, shared experiences is being able to resist against the personal desire, like, and for that I mean my personal desire as a creator to
Hmm.
cast judgment against like the people who I have experienced in the world. Like I live in a nominally progressive, nice quaint college town in southern Indiana that is surrounded by white supremacists and militia groups.
Hmm.
um, and so like this is part of the fabric of my daily life, is resisting against these people, trying to show up against them and show up for what is great about my community. But this is where comics works on the page as a way to work through it. It works as therapy, and it allows me as a storyteller to be able to convey these experiences without telling people how they should feel about it.
Hmm. Hmm.
And this is where we get into the non-textual, non-verbal information, this emotive information, this very subjective information. Um, and because those experiences are pretty broadly shared, it simply allows readers oftentimes to feel seen in their own experiences. This is something I take for granted as a cartoonist, is like whenever something strikes me in my daily life, oftentimes I work through it and clarify what I think and what I feel on the
Hmm.
page, even if it's just in my sketchbook. I take for granted that I have the ability to kind of filter through that in comics. And so when Save It for Later came out, it was I was sort of shocked at the degree to which people responded to it, because it was finally kind of giving voice in a non-judgmental way, in a non-leading way, to allow people to feel seen through these experiences. And the same goes for having a subjective and objective account of the civil rights movement through the March trilogy, is being able to lay out a very well-researched and documented history of the movement, but also being able to lean on John Lewis's firsthand memories and experiences in that movement. Basically, being tasked with conveying these experiences through his eyes and in his words, but also sort of then taking the burden off of me as a cartoonist to lead people to a conclusion based on those. Teaming up together with John Lewis and with Andrew to do that, but hopefully effectively setting a stage that allows people to draw their own conclusions.
Love that. Yeah. Well, and all the decisions, all the processes that you were talking through. I know the intensive nature that folks have talked about on the program of making comics just as like a physical reality. But I'm also hearing a lot of these kind of ideological choices and philosophical choices to bring together what you want on the page as well. So it's pretty complex work to do.
Yes, it's very immersive. It really, like, comics are so interesting simply because they do encapsulate and synthesize so many of my interests in communicating and in my interest in capturing the world that I experience, and my sense of kind of wonder and curiosity for the world outside of my experience. And I spent many years like playing in punk bands and sort of doing collective creative experiences that involve a lot of collaboration, a lot of compromise, and sort of a decentralized creative experience. And it made me increasingly value how I was able to kind of go into my cave and make comics here at the table that require a lot of focus, a lot of time, and sort of require at times shutting the entire world out to have a very crystallized, specific mode of expression. So I appreciate the sort of like dynamic possibilities for how people are creative. And I appreciate that comics can both be very meticulous and very mindful of what's happening, but can also be very spontaneous, very free, and can function in a really kind of flowing way. Like, they don't have to be that serious. They don't have to be that meticulous. This is where comics can also be something that allow us to express something in the space of 30 minutes or an hour just to get it out into the world.
Yeah. And you continue to explore possibilities. I did not mention you have a piece from your earlier career that was more of an anthology piece as well, and then Two Dead with Van Jensen. And I know that you have some books on the way as well.
Yes.
One of those being an adaptation.
You bet. Oftentimes, for the last decade, most of the time I've managed to make a living as a full-time cartoonist by doing at least 2 books at once. I'm kind of trying to finally reset the playing field, so I'm able to focus on 1 book at a time. But usually it's 1 fiction work, 1 nonfiction work. And I just finished 2 back-to-back books. Yeah, one is my next fiction graphic novel called Fall Through. It'll be out in February. And then I have spent the last 3 years doing a full comics adaptation of the late, great James Llewellyn's Lies My Teacher Told Me, which will be out in April. And that it's interesting spending so many years doing nonfiction collaborations with other writers. I've developed definitely like a set of preferences and skills and stuff going into each project. But along the way, like there are a lot of ways in which I feel like the years I spent working on March
Hmm. Hmm.
prepared me, but required leveling up one more time to be able to really like consolidate a lot of information and make it function in a digestible way through comics, like turning this prose work into this comics work.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
and it's wild to think that, like 3 years of work or 3.5 years of work can be boiled down, into a 2 hour reading experience. But that's
Hmm.
also sort of that's the price we pay with our precious comics.
Right, right. And lots of decisions. I mean, thousands upon thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of decisions in that process, I'm sure.
Definitely. It's funny because, like, I read this book many times in the 2000s and the 2010s, and it was pretty formative to me. And even more formative, by the way, was his 2007 book, Sundown Towns: A Hidden Dimension of American Racism.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
yeah, he emailed me out of the blue right before the pandemic asking if I might be interested in adapting this. And I just wrote back without consulting anyone. I was like, just to let you know, yes, definitely. We'll work out the details, but I'm going to go ahead and just start today. I'm very excited. I've waited my whole life to do this. So a
Awesome,
lot of it
awesome.
was during the pandemic, rereading several times, except having a mind for how to turn these hundreds of pages of information
Hmm.
into something that functioned. So choosing what to keep, what to cut, what was necessary. And then, like, these are James Llewellyn's words, but I also like this is a full adaptation. So I'm also rewriting the book. And a
Hmm.
lot of that meant that then I would go into my sketchbook and by hand, I would write out a new script based on his words for the book as I
Oh,
broke it
wow,
down
wow.
into pages.
Uh-huh.
And then from there, as I penciled the book, I would rewrite the entire book again in pencil.
Hmm.
And then for editing, I rewrote the book a fourth time as a Word document so that copy editors and editors could work with me. And then I rewrote the book a fifth time by lettering it in ink and then drawing over that. It was like simply the text side of it was much more all consuming than I thought it was going to be. And it actually made a lot of the imagery within the panels. It had a very important task to convey a lot of information, which we,
Hmm.
like in the ways that we just covered. But that was also sort of my breath of fresh air. The fact that I was spending a whole lot of time trying to do justice to, but also update James Llewellyn's words. The panel artwork was really where I was kind of like set free and able to breathe and express myself a bit.
Wow, wow, it's an impressive and definitely a process-oriented task.
Without a doubt. And each book has its own unique process. And sometimes, like, you enter the book thinking you know how it's going to work. And
Hmm.
then very quickly along the way, you realize that like an entirely different set of approaches is going to be necessary. And that's part of the fun.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and it comes through on the page, and it also speaks to the need to reread graphic novels because you were talking about that
Yes.
2 hour experience. There's a lot to take in. So definitely a fan of going back, close noticing, rereading, taking in those pages, and thinking about all of those choices.
Without a doubt. And I'd say, like, in books, in comics, and in movies, I have always been drawn to storytelling that is either intentionally vague or open-ended,
Hmm.
or which may
Hmm.
have a circular or a cyclical component. But these types of narratives, which seem to demand viewing again or reading again, have always been the most compelling to me.
Hmm.
And so it's interesting the way that works, not only with fiction but with nonfiction. And part of the power of comics is that a particular panel, an image will stick in your mind. And sometimes, if you want to go back and just check out a panel, that's your invitation to crack open the book. And as you're looking for the panel, then you sort of start swimming around. And
Hmm.
even once you locate it, then you're kind of like moving before and after that panel, and it's an automatic invitation to re-experience the entire comic.
And at the same time, you were working on Fall Through
Oh yes, without a doubt. And
to add some rock and roll to your life.
yeah, and a lot of that is like when I'm writing my own stories, the writing takes considerably longer than the art stage. And a lot of that is simply I just feel more confident at the end, getting in and penciling and inking and painting. But it takes time for characters and motivations and themes, motifs, and repetitions to emerge. So yeah, I started working on Fall Through maybe in 2019, and those books kind of overlapped for several years. And then once it came time to choose a lane and actually ink and finish a book, it was just a matter of scheduling and what was going to work best for both works as a whole. So yeah, they were both kind of written and penciled in tandem. And then I just went back to back and then inked and finished 500 pages in a row over the course of 2 years.
Wow, wow. So, as you're thinking about next creative steps, anything that I know that sometimes those things can't be talked about, but anything that you would like to pursue next as these two books are entering the world?
Certainly. Like what's nice is right now I'm actually able to, I'm very fortunate that I'm in this brief window where I'm able to actually take care of other things while I'm not just jumping straight into a book. But I also have no chill at all in life. So my way of relaxing is basically working on a follow-up prequel to Fall Through.
Oh, wow.
But I try to make it fun. It's like a lot of it is like I'll cut and paste these little, or cut and staple these little mini comics
Oh,
and use
nice.
these to kind of rough out how the book's going to go. So I'm just spending a lot of time just kind of, I thought that Fall Through was going to be a self-contained book, and I was actually so sad that I would never draw or write these characters again, that a few months, 6 months after I finished the book, I thought up one scene. I was like, maybe I'll just draw this one scene. It'll be nice to kind of reconnect with these characters. And a couple months later, things just started falling into place. And all of a sudden, these characters where I thought the book was literally closed on them, I realized that Fall Through is actually a much smaller book, character wise, than what has just opened up with this follow up prequel. And it's amazing the ways in which fiction not only allows us to talk about much more topical things and real life things, but the fact that when you're living with characters and getting to know characters, there's this magical point at which characters actually surprise you by revealing things about themselves, making decisions seemingly independent of the creator. And that seems kind of silly, but that's actually what happens. And when a possibility opens up, you're like, oh, this is why this character is motivated this way, or this is how they would experience this. It changes the course of what you're doing. And so like, yeah, it's been so rewarding and interesting that 7 months ago this book did not exist, and I'm getting ready to pencil it now. I've been spending the last 6 months writing it, and it's just another case of like characters and stories surprising me again and again. So that's mostly what I'm focused on right now.
But I love that the journey is continuing, and I love those writing processes that then become something else that you unpack, and every story leading to more stories. Anything that we've missed in the talk through that you want to make sure to share before we close out our episode?
Well, I think maybe the only thing that would be sort of interwoven into this, as we're talking about the unique strengths of comics, is to recognize that comics are sort of the canary in the coal mine for a lot of sort of reality averse campaigns to control information, particularly in classrooms, in libraries. And one reason why is because of the strengths of comics, but also because of the highly specific weakness of comics, which is that because they are pictorial and visual, it's very easy to find content which at first glance seems to be, questionable, and that's
Hmm.
fair enough, but
Hmm.
can be taken not only without context, but without actually reading the book and used as ammunition by these reality averse information control campaigns. So
Hmm.
uh, I did team up with the American Library Association to do this little informational poster called Comics Are Reading, which you'll see back
Yes.
there on the back wall, that
Hmm.
sort of outlines some of those unique strengths, some of the weaknesses, things to watch out for. Because as we're sort of we're all doing the work and we're all taking different levels of risks to speak up for comics to help protect the reading experiences of people young and old. It's important that we learn how to talk about what comics does in our minds and
Hmm.
in our hearts, how we're actually reading them, how they function. And I would encourage everyone to get familiar with
Hmm.
articulating that experience for themselves. Uh, the hack is that you can actually download that poster as a free PDF
Oh,
from
nice,
the
nice.
ALA, and you don't have to pay for it. So you can search that out, and it's an important job, and things are going to get crazier and worse in the coming years in that regard. So
Hmm.
buckle up, but also equip yourselves with the ability to talk about comics and talk about these reading experiences and their ability to transform people.
Yeah, yeah, and proceed with compassion always,
For
and
sure.
empathy, as you were mentioning earlier. Is it okay if I take the image and use it as sort of a visual lead-in
Oh
or a
yes,
social media lead-in? Okay,
go
great,
right
great.
ahead.
All right. Well, it's been a pleasure to sort of fade into the background here,
It has
um,
been.
to spotlight your work and to spotlight the things that you in turn spotlight and bring attention to. And so I greatly appreciate it. I appreciate your time, and I'm glad to talk anytime to share about the work you're doing.
Likewise, have me on whenever.
All
It's
right,
been great.
wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.